Firstly, before I begin, I would like to take a moment to make an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise the continuing connections to lands, waters, cultures and communities. We pay our respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders elders, past, present and emerging. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Kathryn and I will be taking you through this presentation today, discussing the controversial topic of if Australia Day should change its date from 26 January. Australia Day, currently marked on the calendar 26 January, and for many non-Indigenous Australians, the day may be a celebration which might include a very positive outlook, with summer barbecues at the beach with friends and family, fireworks, drinking alcohol as it's the Aussie thing to do, having parties with friends. For a lot of employed Australians, it is a public holiday, a day off to party that's paid. Terrific. The world-famous Australian Open tennis tournament runs on Australia Day, and Australians are very well known for mixing drinking and sports together, so great times again for some. Dripping yourself in Australian merchandise and Australian paraphernalia, flags around the neck, painted faces, blow-up kangaroos, we have all seen this. So to many, Australia Day is just a good, fun time. But not everybody celebrates the day that way. Australia Day looks different, especially for Indigenous Australians, who some call Invasion Day. To many Indigenous Australians, it is a day that represents tragedy, a day that represents pain, represents loss, represents theft, humiliation, and ongoing trauma that still continues to haunt Indigenous people. They look at 26 January as a survival day for one of the oldest cultures on earth. The destruction and suffering of their very peaceful people. They also look at Australia Day as a day of mourning. So is it obvious for the date to change? To Indigenous people, yes, it is very obvious why the date should change. Their elders and their history is very well understood within their people. Although there is disconnection from its historical meaning in our society, for example, the stolen generation, children who were taken from their mothers still carry the trauma and heartache, and this is definitely not a day to celebrate being Australian for them. I believe the feeling would be the complete opposite. To non-Indigenous people with an educated knowledge of the history of colonialism, yes, it's obvious to change when you understand the history. To non-Indigenous Australian people with not very well educated knowledge of the history, then no, it's not obvious. To Australian immigrants with little to no knowledge of Australian history, no, it's not obvious to change the date. In Brisbane, there was a survey done between two different groups. One, a group of people taking, the first group, group of people taking part in the Invasion Day protests, which are held on Australia Day across the country, and another group of people taking part in celebrations in a public park and not part of the protest. What is interesting is that both groups showed that historical recognition of colonialism and both samples were above the midpoint of the scale, which means the non-protesters recognize and have knowledge of colonialism and the First Nation people and some idea of the history there. Does the temptation of a paid day off to watch sports with your mates in the park and drink alcohol and party throughout the day outweigh the thought of spending the day to reflect and accept what 26 January really means to Australia's First Nation people? Have we just made it too easy to ignore? Where has it gone so wrong? On some slight positives, things that have changed. Up until 2017, Australia's biggest music celebration of the Triple J's Hottest 100 was played in the background of many Australia Day parties and celebrations and was sometimes the focus of the day. Now, it may not seem like a major point, but Triple J is a radio station that has a huge youthful listener following. Leading with this example in front of such a large young audience is a huge statement, and hopefully shifting young non-Indigenous Australians' view and education around January 26. Telstra, Australia's biggest telco, have acknowledged the difficulties that this day can bring and have offered their employees to work on a day and take an alternative paid day off. Retail brand Kmart stopped producing Australia Day merchandise to ensure it is inclusive and respectful for all. 10 Network also recognised that January 26 is not a day of celebration and employees are welcome to the same options as Telstra where they can take an alternative day off. We really only have to look back at slide 4 to see reasons on why the date should change. I believe that Indigenous people would not be so passionate and ongoing in this fight if they weren't so truly hurt and humiliated by how the rest of the country can behave on this day. But to add to the list of reasons are displays of racism, insensitive to Australia's true tragic history. 1 January 1901, when the states federated to become a country and Australia became the official name, I believe that this is when the date should be celebrated, when Australia became the official name of this country. But then others argue the reasons why it should just stay the same, 26 January. Because this date can be changed, of course, but the past cannot. We can't rewrite history. The tokenistic change could just be that, just a token, and not really go on to be anything else other than a date change. The government may believe that national unity and achievement is marked and celebrated on this day, and it's not all about our history, and it's not all about Aboriginal people, some might say. Also, the Australian of the Year awards are the day before Australia Day and is a sign of the start of the celebrations. But what if? What if the date were to remain the same, but the meaning behind the celebrations were to change? There should be a day to celebrate all things Australian, and that's exactly what it should be. All things Australian. Indigenous and non-Indigenous past, present and future shift the education and celebration to include both the history of colonialism and what it did to Indigenous people, whether it be through song, dance, a moment of silence to reflect and remember on the past, including the First Nations of the country into all Australia Day celebrations. Some of the challenges that come up are, of course, political issues, and within the political system there are history denialists who just flat out deny what happened to Indigenous people was wrong or humane. There are people who believe that the arrival of Europeans was the best thing for the Indigenous people, as they saved them, provided them a better future. Some people just believe it's not that important, and there's no other date really suitable. And would it even make a difference if we changed the date? Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my little presentation. I hope that I've provided enough information for you to take home and be thoughtful and mindful. And thank you very much.